I'm not sure how many of you here have come from the school and or the camp at Ginger, and how many of you are new? So if you're new, could you just put your hand up if you weren't in those camps? Okay, about half the people, good. So you may or may not have been able to watch those presentations. I don't think they're all uploaded. So the presentations that I want to do this week are really a continuation of those studies that were done both at the school and then at the camp. I know we're at a time period where the subject of liberalism, that's a term that people are using now, has become a real subject of contention in our movement. In different ways, this subject is impacting or affecting our movement. For many of you, questions are arising because of the relationship that men have with women and women with men, and how they're supposed to interact with one another. Now the subject of equality has been brought to the forefront. We know that those questions are important because they affect people's personal lives. We're already nearly at the middle of February, and we really have only a short few months before Panium arrives. We're not at a place yet where we are certain what that date will be. All we currently have is the year. But what we do recognize and understand is that these differences, these questions, that this unity that's rampant in our movement needs to end. It needs to end before the harvest of the Levites begin. And there isn't much time for that to happen. As I say, I know people have questions, particularly about marriage, about how couples are supposed to interact or relate to one another. I'm not sure if you have such questions. Issues surrounding the subject of dowry has come up over and over again. As I say, we recognize these are important issues. But it seems to me that there are other issues connected with this subject of equality that we are putting to one side. A while ago, when we began to explain or understand the relationship between the priests, Levites, and Nethinims, the question was asked, if this is the close of probation for the priests, 2019, Sometimes it's identified as raffia. And this is a point in time or what we might call the harvest. Why is there this gap between the close of probation for the priest and the Levites? This was a period for their harvest. Why is there this period here? And at the time, I gave a suggestion that there are a number of ways to respond to that, but I gave a structural response, a response based upon the structure of these lines. So if you see this history here for the priests, it has some characteristics that are different than the history of the Levites. Now, people have asked, why is the close of probation for the priests a singular point and the close of probation for the Levites is a period of time? I think that question has been answered many times, but sometimes people still have a misunderstanding of that. So if I can just explain it this way. Part of the problem is the relationship between a movement and individuals. So you know that we speak about baptism occurring at 9/11. And yet many of you were not in the movement until years later. 10, 15 years perhaps. Maybe you weren't even Adventist then. Some of you may not have even been born then. So, how could you have been baptized? What does that baptism mean? What's it referring to? So, when you begin to explore those questions, you begin to see that we're actually dealing with two issues. The work for an individual and the work for a movement or a church. In fact, Ellen White addresses this issue. People were inclined in her day, if the people around them, their fellow brothers and sisters, were not progressing, that they would want to separate from them and push forward in their reforms or in their doctrines. And Ellen White commenting on that mindset would say that the Lord is not waiting or collecting individuals here and there. His purpose is to create a movement. We call it a church. She says he's waiting to gather a people, not individuals. And we recognize that concept when we start thinking about the church triumphant, the stone of Daniel 2, even when we start thinking in terms of institutions. So when we think about 9/11, being baptism, it's at the level of this movement or level of institution or level of priests. It's not about an individual work. Now, at a very simple level, if this was the close of probation, which we might identify as a shut door, if you were a priest and you wanted to get into the household of God, you must enter in while the door is open. I think that's obvious, really. Because once the door shuts, it will be too late for you. So, priests, such as you and I, have been entering into this movement one after the other over the past 30 years. Many of us, in fact, almost the vast majority of those who came into this movement in the early days have already left. Through one test or another, they have fallen into the wicked world below. So we're now at a place where there are very few people who were here before 2014. And we discussed this phenomena in the camp meeting in Ginger. For those of us who were there, can anybody remember the two Spirit of Prophecy references that we went to show that? To show this group of people that have left. So we had great controversy, 608. Sorry? Good. And Testimonies to the Church, Volume 8, page 41.8. And these two references help to explain not only the reason, but the dynamic of the great exodus out of this movement. And we saw that that exodus has occurred over the past 5 years, from 2014 to 2019. As I say, we saw the characteristics of who was leaving and also the reasons why they were leaving. We then saw that many people have entered into the movement over that 5-year history. And I suspect that's most of you here. So I've just done it in this simplified fashion that people are entering into the movement. And we'll just call it the last one. The last one enters just before the door shuts. Now, this person who has just entered in the last few moments, if they were to begin to work, conceptually you can see what the problem is. That they're not trained to do that work. Hopefully everybody can see that. So when I was asked the question about why is there this space, the reason that was given was that these people who are coming at the end,
Ni ame bini ya gikini.
could you see that? He's got his light on. The people who are coming at the end,
Ni ame bini gini ya giki.
they need time to get up to speed, to be trained.
Gin miro gini chao me yo punji.
And that's what this time period is for.
Eno mi o ka no that here.
So there's a period of growth
Tikara me dono.
before all of the priests
Ame o nam do ge duch.
go and do a work for the Levites, for their harvest.
Wor sha ge ti kyo levi kan me ka gi.
And that seemed, from a structural perspective, a reasonable explanation of why things are working out this way.
Alo be ke no line tu kete ke ne balo gina me no tie ti mere ni.
We could explain it a different way.
Da ro ko bi yoro kene.
If we were to think about the line of Christ,
Kano lo tam yoro Kristo.
and we were to think about the work that Jesus is about to do,
Tata mo ti te me no Kristo no yoro ti.
we saw that he begins to do his work when he's 30 years of age.
Ne mi cha ti che ke mo ha piera de.
We could see that this movement came of age here in 2019.
Onani wo ti yoro mo ha no no I mo me ya pala bo.
So we were now ready to do a work.
Wando utiamo yi ha kometi you teach.
We observed that in the Old Testament it says that a priest is required to work for 20 years, beginning at 30 and ending at 50.
Ne anu ni shika shon uta ko no nam do mi ti gibi mo ki piera yo. Ja ki mo ha piera de te yo ke mo ha piera bi.
We took the symbol of 30,
Kano kwa yo piera de ko no.
saw that we as priests, as a movement, were now 30 years old,
Ne wano nam do chalo wo do ti mo ha piera de.
so we should begin to do a work.
Mi ro chak ti shuko.
People accepted that logic.
Yo te yi tam mo no ko.
But then, of course, we remembered
Akara ho te for you.
that before Jesus begins to clean the church,
Ne ya Yesu ku po cha ho.
the house of God, in John chapter 2, there's a work of preparation that he needs to do. This work of preparation is in addition to the preparation that he's done for the past 30 years. So this is when he gets driven by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness for 40 days. So we saw a time of preparation that was needed before he would begin to clean the house of God. So there was an explanation there of why there was this time of preparation. Then we had another story, also in the time of Christ. And this was not when Jesus began his ministry, but when he ended his ministry. So he now ends his ministry, it's the cross, and he's in the grave where there is no work to do. Resurrects. And there's this 50-day period from his death and resurrection to when the church is going to begin to turn its attention to evangelizing the Jewish nation. We call that Pentecost. So we discovered another time period of preparation and training. So we were quite confident, we hope that you are, that this time period here is a period of preparation before we go to the church. Now, this may seem insignificant to you, It may seem an interesting observation. It may be a confirmation of why things are the way they have turned out to be. But I want us to realize something. Now, maybe unbeknownst to you, maybe it caught you by complete surprise, but as Elder Tess has spoken both publicly and privately, that it didn't catch her by surprise. And the thing that I'm referring to is the separation that's occurred in our movement. Now, the work of separation itself should not have surprised us. As I said, we've got strong models to show this separation. And the separation would occur before the close of probation, not after it. And we've seen that separation occur, as I said, from 2014 and onward. I want to make the point, when we did this study about separation, we made an important observation that the separation before 2019 that's occurring in this 5-year period, we'll put a big S here, cannot be explained by using Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and tares. So we took quite some time to explain that. You cannot use this parable to explain what's occurred in our movement. It's these passages that explain. So maybe we won't have time to go into that, but I want to put that in the public record here for you. So all these people are leaving, and it culminates in the final separation. The final separation is between this movement and Future for America. And as I say, it takes many people by surprise. But if you go back and check her public record, you can't check her private record, of course. She will explain that she began to see this many, many months before the separation actually occurred. In fact, if you go back, you can see how that ministry had set itself up to fall. It had put stumbling blocks in its place ahead of it that made it very difficult for it to pass this test. And that should be a word of caution for us, that we should not set up roadblocks based upon our belief system that will cause us to fall in the future. When the test comes, you know that it doesn't come arbitrarily, it doesn't come in a vacuum. How do we know that?
Wano ngeo manu ningo.
We know that because we have created lines.
Wano ngeo manu pi wano chikere line.
Perhaps the most important model that we have of this line is the agricultural model.
Gino pi ete kalala wano chikere belu yore me fu.
And if you can express it this way,
Kaira wako buro kiti nyo.
that these final tests that occur at the very end,
Yate ama gini belu ya giki.
there is always a work of preparation beforehand.
Kiti je yi hame bela menu kana popo tu.
So in this room,
Yo tiene.
there are more than 100 people,
Tijo apol akarumi ya chelo ko.
and we already know
Wano ngeo.
that a number of us, perhaps many of us, are about to fail the test.
Tijo apol ya kina wa chegi poto gina temagi.
The test that is about to come in this dispensation.
Te ame chegi binu iruna nyeni.
You might ask, how do I know?
Kaya no penyu ni ada ngeni ngo.
Besides the fact of the very definition of the gospel,
Apart kere agon me amuta be.
especially when we think of the second angel,
Kawan tama marika Mario.
who has two messages,
Medige kwena rioni.
a message of success and a message of failure.
Kwena me kara nyukere kwena me po.
That is enough for us to know that people in this room will fail.
Man me wa ngini jo ati yo tine aporo ginoko.
But when it comes to your personal walk with God,
Edo karo bili woti in kere kero ba.
the reason why you will fall
Ginomi ini poro.
is based upon your response
Loga ke kita be ye kere.
to the work of preparation that has occurred in your life up to this moment and in the next coming weeks and months.
Lo tije yi hamoti mere ameno kara ku poromu. Kere ikini kere me kara me sabina nyinchi.
And you may not be conscious of it,
In pera ungeyo.
but what you're required to do,
Ogina me mita me ini timu.
as the Bible says,
Bible ko.
is to examine yourself to see whether or not you're in the faith.
Nini ini teme kane no kai ti ye.
And too many of us are not in the faith.
Yo apoli ya kiro apegi ye.
And this is the problem that Future for America are experiencing here in this period where they are failing the test.
Nano do gina me otime ko future for America kara me ginu tia atemu ye here me potu gina temu.
It doesn't become evident
Pe beru gina pere tek.
for many of us until September 2019.
Pe yo apol borwa na tulibema biru ma per ya apara bogwen.
But you can already see it visible
E yinu no ne no kotika na lera
a
ne.
year before.
Mwa chela ni.
A year before,
Mwa chela me no kara.
you can already see them failing the test.
Mwa nu ne ni kita potu gina tema ki oko.
Now, the reason why I mention that,
Gino mi apo mando no.
that it doesn't come as a surprise
Ni pe beru gina mo tua.
to the leader of this movement,
Pia tela me woti ne.
is that it should not be a surprise.
Tieni mi no pe beru gina mo tua.
If we understand what our line is teaching and showing us.
Kawan nyangi na me line wata nyutiwa.
Which brings me back to the question
Mero do go up ya pen.
of why there is this period here.
Pingo kara kini me kara tie.
So I've already addressed it
Ana lo ho ye.
at this very basic and simple level.
Yore mero ma yota te kala wala.
This last priest,
Alam do ga gikino.
it's to help that person
Tie me konyo na no.
have this time of preparation
Betere kara me yi here.
to warn the Levites,
Me ya konya kin bang levi.
to begin to interact with them
Me chakulo keji.
in a way that draws them out of their Adventist Laodicean condition.
Yore mero no wa ge ko iberu gi me do dukia.
So hopefully that's explainable, that's understandable.
Again ni manu beru gi ngara ni aere.
Now the reason why this becomes so significant
Gino mi gi lo da gina pere tek tuwa.
is because in this separation that's occurring in our movement,
Beru ni pina po ha meno ti yi woti ne.
this movement,
Woti.
Church Triumphant,
Anisha law.
Future for America.
To the future for America.
Now I say the Church Triumphant and Future for America, obviously they will reverse this and say that they are the Church Triumphant and we are some schism.
Aroko bukito gino la ko yum to ete koni gine be anisha law wan be ka jomo ko
That's a given, isn't it?
Mono go gina meeting.
They will call us the false prophet, we'll call them false prophets.
Gina lo wan wan bo dwat mo go wan lo ngini bo dwat mo go.
So, in this split,
Ipo here ni
the two factions, the two groups,
yo ar yo mo po here.
are going to hold on to many of the concepts, many of the truths that we both shared before the split.
Gindu sha makatena apola meno yo tia nyaka meno po here.
Some of those ideas, some of those models,
Sambono yo mo ameno tie no no.
we're going to begin to see and express them in different ways.
Uchaku tikigi yo ra papa.
There really is not going to be anything new,
Pa beru ginora nyen.
no super new doctrine that's going to come up.
Pedi poye mo ro nyen na tek ameno adonyo ha.
It's really going to be a recycling of the old,
Aberu yi kumena chon.
an explanation of existing truths or doctrines.
Bera gama penya meno tia kom punya meno karchen.
But in the explanation of those things, there are going to be substantial differences.
Tek cha ro bonyu jamino ala apola ti mere.
Now, the reason I say that Elder Tess saw these things long before September last year
Ginumi anakoni elates neno ginu kameno duema abomo enfokorano mwakaro.
is because in our movement,
Beni pieni wormani.
during the Midnight Cry era,
Karme wo me sunyu.
we could say September 2018 to September 2019,
Anakoni iduema bongen matmeria para boro na iduema bongen matmeria para bongen.
the differences between our methodology and their methodology began to be clearly seen.
Apa yo tiju bakere yo tiju bena meno tia nenu pena chien tuwa.
And if you were here in that time period,
Tano unity ikinikene me kano kan.
particularly here on the continent of Africa,
Kano unity Africa kan ni.
you knew that there was a wave of sentiment that was being expressed
Butiki koli gina meno tia bena meno beta kopo.
in the following fashion.
Yora ni ene.
The disciples of FFA
Okwena future for America.
and the disciples of this movement.
Kero okwena me woti ene.
But in that period,
Ikinikene me kare no.
both this movement and FFA didn't want to have a separation, so they said that these things were not true.
Woti ene kere future for America no pena me for. Tekoni ginu peti ateni.
They didn't want it to be true,
Ginu pena me ti bena ateni.
even though the evidence was clear
Kare ko beli shede no tika na le.
that there was these differences.
Ni apo ha ni tie.
The methodology that we began to refine,
Yo tija me wana cha ko lonyo no ro kuye.
based upon two major themes:
Alobe kere we cover ya don.
time
Chawa
and geography.
kere kan rumwa.
When we began to refine our message on those two principles,
Wana cha ko lonyo kwena alobe kere yo ari ono.
quietly,
Aling
without people realizing,
Abon jo e poyo.
Future for America
Future for America.
was formalizing,
Nutia aketuko kikara che.
was collecting a group of teachers
Nuta choko gino kunye.
who are also refining their understanding of time and geography.
Menatia alo ropo gini nyangi kum chawa kere kana morumwa.
And when this exploded in the separation only a few months ago, it caught people by surprise.
Kara mero te tu na po here utu jo apola tua.
But it didn't catch the leadership of the movement by surprise.
Endo po tu utela me wora tua.
Because the Midnight Cry messenger had been keeping a track of what was happening.
Pien ngata mo mi kwena me wo me tu ni wonta alo bukida me jami cha uti timere.
As I say, it's in the public record.
Kina mera ko kritika na tilo yo kero ko ha kana jo tro.
If you go back and check,
Borineni.
this wasn't just once.
Po beru kai chela ke.
This was mentioned a number of times.
Yo ko uti na pol.
That in that history,
Ni kini kini me kare no.
there was to be found two prophets.
Yo anu mudu api ario.
The true prophet
Adwa pinga goba.
and the false prophet.
Adwa pinga teni ke
And that model was taken from the New Testament story from the book of Acts. And people either questioned privately, or perhaps they didn't even question. What was Elder Tess referring to? Now it's evident that she was referring to the work of formalizing FFA's teachers. You might call it their thought leaders. The people who are going to define their doctrine, their dogma. And those teachers, those people, were not Elder Jeff Pippinger. He was not one of them. And perhaps that people didn't appreciate that. So they have formalized, they have now got their teachers who have developed their message based upon many of the truths and principles that were defining our movement in the pre-2014 era. We will say they've taken those concepts and they've twisted and manipulated them. Of course, they will accuse us of the same. Now, each of us needs to come to our own conclusion of who is correct and who is wrong on that issue. Now, this simple observation about this time period here, from 19 to 21, this period of training, of preparation of the priests may seem something that is not of much significance to us. But this is what strikes at the heart of this issue when you consider the separation. Who is the false prophet and who is the true prophet? Now, the separation that's occurred was a separation of people of my own household. People who used to work together and love one another. And some of them still have friendships. So let me come to the point that I want us to see. As we consider the time period that we call the harvest of the priests, which we say all happens at a point, then why this period? We could call it Jacob's time of trouble, the time of preparation. We could call it that. And I want us to hold that thought in our minds and what that time period looks like. Because it's fairly well established. Now, in this study, we're dealing with many thoughts. And I know it's difficult to hold them all together in your mind. We've come to a place where we need to be trained and prepared before we give the message to the Levites. We understood this before we even entered into this period. Before this, there was a separation. the final separation of the priests. This is explained from GC 608, Testament of 8 Church, Volume 8. It's not explained from Matthew 13. We need this period because the last priest is not fully trained to give the message to the Levites. So hopefully we're clear on that. In the midnight cry message, the work of separation is beginning. For some people it occurred in 2014. But what we're referring to is the separation between Future for America and this movement. In fact, you could say that it begins by a mission trip to Africa itself, which is interesting because it begins in Africa and it ends in Africa because Future for America are desirous to continue their work here. And to try to persuade the brothers and sisters here that this movement is a satanic movement. On one thing we agree with them, that there are false prophets and true prophets. And they both claim to represent God. And in the context of the messages that we speak of, both claim to use the same or correct methodology. But they will tell us, or so they will tell you, that we're using an incorrect methodology and they're using a true methodology. Whilst we're here this week, you need to make the assessment of whether that accusation by them is true and whether our accusation against them is true. Which leads us to this point. We're in a time period of preparation. We're all familiar with the story of Elijah. Now, is Elijah a true or a false prophet? He's a true prophet. In this history here, which we would call the harvest of the priests, we might also call it the training, preparation. We might also call it Jacob's time of trouble. When we talk about Elijah, we could equally call this Elijah's time of trouble. Couldn't we? What does he want to do in this history? What does he request God? He wants to say, God, it was better that I would be dead. Kill me. He's desirous of suicide, if you like. He says it was better that he was never born. His world is collapsing all around him. And he's a true prophet. You go back or go to the future and see Ellen White's commentary on the time of trouble in the Great Controversy, chapter 39. And she'll explain the experience of God's people, his true prophets. It's one of struggle. lack of direction,
Bera meno pe kere kana mi woro ye.
lack of confidence,
Bera meno geni petie.
questioning their past experience,
Kunoti pe ngiri kara ngi kara ngi cha.
trying to hold on to God
Chaku temo ngiri makuba.
and to have assurance
Kere me pero kere moha.
that He has not abandoned them.
Nigi en ko wa hu ko.
And why?
Pingo.
Why do they have these feelings?
Pingo ginti gini kore kore yeni.
It becomes an important question to answer.
Bera penyo api ya check to alka wa.
And when you go to the great controversy version of this story, you cannot find the answer there.
Kai wori donya donki na me ko kere impera ngam.
But if you go to the story of Elijah,
Ero kai woro ko pelia.
there it's clear.
Tikuna shil to twal.
It's clear
Tia shil.
why his relationship with God has broken down.
Gina mi wa tere kero ba to ko.
What has he done?
Timo mo.
He has failed in his mission.
Por ko ti denu mi timi.
As he enters into Jezreel
Carmeno ta don Jezreel.
and he gets threatened,
Yote bure.
his faith weakens
Ye me do ko pin.
and he loses hold of God.
Aka enter wenyu. Tero wenyu ba ko.
That is the experience of the true prophet in this history.
Mono beru gina me do apenga tena beru gini kere kini me kare.
We see the same experience in the history of Christ.
Mana no kwa shelo ni ikopo kare ko Christ.
What happens
Muhammad timere.
after Christ dies
Yung Christ to.
with the disciples?
Kom kwena.
They lose faith
Ye gi wenyu ko.
in the movement,
Ikom word.
and the movement becomes scattered and directionless.
Word ekero kwa me ka word gi pe.
Now, as we think about that,
Tawa no tamu mano.
I want us to see something that's happening.
Sa me to no ni gina me da timere.
Future for America
Future of America.
are saying
Jacob ngini ni.
that they now are rising in power
Nigi ti don gini kere teho.
and influence,
Kere bela meni jira ngi.
whilst this movement
Kun go tine.
are crumbling and collapsing.
Kia to wala to wala tere tengi no ko.
We have no message to offer,
Pe kere kwena mama miro mi.
at least one that is not true.
Na po bela tene ni.
They, on the other hand,
Gini tungcha.
have been busily grabbing and drawing in all the threads of truth
Gini da waya gini tola tene long.
during the midnight cry history.
Gini me kar me wo me shunyu wo.
They have collected their teachers,
Jo gini ponyege.
their prophets,
Do apingi.
the people who have got their message.
Jo me tikere kwena gi.
They are now fully trained and prepared,
Ponyege yo para yi he gino ko.
and they've come to the surface.
Binu giro ko kana le.
You should know their names.
Yimi ngi nyingi.
If you don't,
Ta pe ngio.
you're not keeping track of the prophetic movements that are occurring before you.
Yi peri ne no kino me wota me no ne buchi mo gida time kere nyimi.
They're about to visit Africa.
Chegile mo gini kane.
And from what I understand, they're about to visit Uganda.
Ageni chegile mo Uganda.
So those people who are about to visit this area
Yo no chegile mo gini kane.
are their thought leaders,
No jo ame lo tamke.
their teachers, their prophets.
Ponyege yo do apingi.
And I don't mean that in an insultive way to call them prophets.
Para ko be ya chame no gino do apingi.
I mean it in the same way that they call the leaders of this movement, the people who are developing our theology and our doctrine, prophets.
Ate ko bi yore cheki na me gini lo gini jo ame da yi ko ponyere wa ni be gino do apingi.
But you must know
Edo yimiri nge.
that in their history, before our harvest, in this history here,
Ni kini me kare me no por ni ka jo kini me kare no.
the true and the false prophets were visible and were being developed.
Do apingi ateni ke me no beru go no tia beru kana me tia ngeno ko.
Now,
Shani.
I'm sure each of you must know
Ageni dara shera sheli ya kinu miro nge.
the Future for America have got a significant and important, a life and death message.
Ageni uni ngini Future for America ni ngini ke ko kwena mara pere te kwena me ko kere to.
Not in the future,
Me pedi ya nyim
but right now,
ti chani.
in this dispensation.
Kini me kare no.
I don't want to make light of how they would express it, but I'll call it the July 18 prediction. And this July 18 prediction, first of all, is nothing new. This July 18 prediction was developed separately from Future for America. They did not develop this prediction, this doctrine. This was done by teachers separate and distinct from Future for America in the history of the Midnight Cry. And these people who came up with this model have risen to prominence and are now the teachers, the premier teachers for that movement, Future for America. Future for America have seen light in their doctrine and have accepted them and promoted them to do the work of teaching. Now, to put it simply, this prediction teaches that in July, on this date, Islam is going to attack the United States for a second time. And this attack will be far more significant than that of 9/11. Now, what I want us to see is separate and distinct from the truthfulness or otherwise of that prediction, whether or not they can prove it's true or whether we can prove that it's not. This is the much more fundamental question. And I want to bring that point in a moment. So, two friends talk. One on their side, one on our side. The one on this side says, do you really believe that Islam is going to attack the United States in Nashville on July 18th? The person says, of course it's going to. The person on our side says that is utter foolishness. How can you believe such a silly doctrine? He says, what are you going to do when it's not going to happen? When it doesn't happen, what will you do then? This person on this side says, on July 19th, maybe I'll reconsider my position. The prediction didn't occur. Maybe I'll change my position and join you. Maybe I'll listen to you then. Now that might sound reasonable, but it doesn't work that way. You have to make your decision on whether or not this is true or not before it happens, not after it happens. So don't stand, as where I come from, don't stand on the fence in the middle. Don't halt between two opinions. Now they call us the prophets of Baal, and we're going to call them the prophets of Baal. But at least we all agree. Don't halt between two opinions, between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You need to make your decision beforehand. Once July 18 comes and goes, it will be too late. If they're right,
Ka gin tika kare.
it'll be too late for us.
Nulo right to 12 P1.
We can't say, oh, sorry.
Koro ko ni
We agree with you now.
We yeke bishani.
We'll join you.
Uno take du.
They already have told us we're not allowed to join them, by the way,
Indo ko gwa ko ni wan koro donyo body kunu.
because our probation,
Bien dogolo me kishawa.
those people who follow the leaders of this movement,
Me logo hotel me woti.
those people who follow Elder Tess,
Ya me logo ela test.
those people are already lost.
Yo lo ruindi ko.
And they have the date.
Ginda lo tige ni mere.
Every one of us should know that date.
Wan duchi kan ni runi wa ni no.
Do you know the date?
Ni o ni no.
The date where it was impossible for you to be saved again.
Ni na me do pe la na ni be na me. Ela re do.
November the 9th.
Ni do bon wene do ma para share.
For them,
Pegin body.
they had a bit more time.
Gindo me ni shawa moro.
Their date was January the 20th.
Gin me gino body de pier yo. Me do ma share.
Both dates have come and gone.
Gin ni no du shu binu te kar binu ko.
So if you're on this side of the movement,
Kai ne di tungi.
you can't wait for July 18th prediction.
Pero no koru gaisha me jo gaisha ni do apara bon do ma be.
This
Manu
issue
copy.
is for those who are undecided.
Pero me ga jo me por po mo tangi.
Those people who still have sympathy with Future for America's doctrinal position.
Ya me potia mar kida me fit of America kunyu kede.
You need to decide beforehand, not afterwards.
Yimbiri mo ta mo pa me kan ko potum pe yo.
And it's sad,
Dan kia right.
I think,
Ana tamoni.
that some of those people who follow them
Yo apola me logo ge.
will try to make a decision afterwards if it failed.
No mo ge tangi yo me ta porko.
Now, why is this so significant, all of this?
Pingo bi do bi pe sekiti.
I want to suggest,
Ana me to koboni.
I want to tell you straight out, in fact,
Ana me to kobu ko do. Aha.
this model
Yoni.
that was already put into place
Me jo ke no ko kar shele.
about the work of preparation
Me kwa ke tite yi here.
that this movement is experiencing,
Me wo titia abe yeni.
that is necessary
Ne me pore ni.
for the priests,
Yolando.
tells us
Kobi wani.
that in this history,
Niki ni ke me karni.
this prediction could not come to pass.
Gaisha ni pero mo show bere.
That the priests
Ni Orlando.
could not be so gathered, so confident
Pero bere me chunji tek to twal.
to make such a significant and important prediction in this history itself,
Me gaisha ni ko gaisha ni kini me karni.
and for it to be fulfilled in this history.
Bere mo show bere kini me karni.
It stands in opposition
Bere me no loktia anoin.
to Elijah.
Kere kwa me ni abe.
Is Elijah doing anything of such significance in his time of trouble?
Liara di mugina pie te karma una me.
Are the 144,000 doing anything of such significance in their Jacob's time of trouble?
Yo la kere pero me te mugina pie te twal di karma una me Jacob.
No.
Fe.
You cannot get a movement
Yi pero no word.
who isn't trained or prepared
Ame po yi hogi.
to make such significant advances
Me ko bugini ko di jama no timal wako.
that are going to happen in the dispensation of training.
Ame gin binu be kere kini me ka me ko ni regi.
This is an easy marker.
Mampo be gina me yo to twal.
It's easy to see
Be gina me ro ne no.
that this is an identification
Be moko.
that Future for America
Ni future for America.
are indeed holding on to false prophecies,
Ya mak gini neba me pedi kakare.
because they're telling you
Yen India ko bini.
that the priests
Ni Orlando.
of this movement
Me woti.
don't know what they're doing.
Penyo ki gina me inji ti magina.
They're not even properly trained.
Yen po po ni regi ne.
And we agree.
We ye kere koko.
On their part,
Bangi.
they say
Yen ko ni.
they have a fully prepared and developed message
Yen di ke kwena mo yi hero ko be.
that their teachers,
Ni o punye ki.
the priests of their movement,
Orlando ke woti.
are already fully trained and prepared
O punye do yi he gino ko ate.
even before they enter into this history.
Mera por do yen kini me kare no.
So you know
Indo inyo.
that they have a model,
Yen di ke yore moro.
a July 18th model,
Many do apara bo me do ma biro.
that stands in direct contradiction
Ame wenya kere.
to the line of the priests and the Levites.
Noro Orlando kere me gulebi.
If you knew nothing else,
Kanu penyo ki noro kene.
even if you didn't read or understand the spirit of prophecy quotes,
Kari ko bedu pe nyang quote.
even if you didn't understand all the details of their prediction,
Kari ko bedu pe nyang gino me gino kero gini tay gaisa gino.
how they've twisted and manipulated time and geography,
Na me gino bedu boy gini kere chawa kere kana no rumba.
you would know
Yuni
from the story of Elijah
kom kopi kom Elia.
and the story of the 144,000
Kopi kom jola chele pira ngana ngai.
that God's messenger
Ni o kwena ba?
could not develop
Ni pera ondo yeko.
such a important prophecy
Nebi mora pira tsai tutwal.
that was predicted and that would be fulfilled in that history.
Me job de shino shobe kin ke me kare.
There's no line to show that.
Pedi yo mame mo manu.
They're now working
Chana gino la ti yugi.
in a framework that is no longer line upon line methodology.
Yo me peti line upon. Ame peti yo re kere yo re.
And they've done it in such a subtle way,
Tim gi yo mo me peping.
many of us are not recognizing this.
Me jo apoli akino pedani.
So as we begin our week together,
Tao cha wan chabi do kara share.
I want us to see
Ada mi ti wano neni.
that if you truly believe in line upon line,
Ikai ye yo re kere yo re.
if you believe in the line of the priests, Levites, Nethinims, 144,000,
Nam do Levi uro kere yo la chele pira ngana men.
particularly the line of the priests and Levites,
Apol le wa me gulam do kere me gulevi.
and you see the relationship between the two,
Dai ne wa me dia kini ngina riono.
that we know that this 2-year period is a time of preparation,
Wano ngiri kini kini me kai mo kare no bo kare me yi here.
that you cannot have a prediction,
Me pera mo kere gaisa mo.
regardless of what the prediction is about.
Prepara me prepara kit ko gaisa me kana me chike.
You cannot have a well-developed model
Pera me kere ponye ma mo yi here be.
at a movement level
I rome movement, I rome word.
that was developed in this history
Kini kini me kare cha.
that's now going to become or come to pass in this history.
Kini shobe kini kini me kare ni.
And that's separate to even analyzing the falsehood of their doctrine,
Mono para do kere kila me ramo kere kila me ponye feri ateni kere.
without analyzing the falsehood of their methodology of time setting and geography,
Abona ne kila me oporo kino ko kere yore me ke tu chao ke kare che kere kila me ginna ne ke ping.
without going into the details of how they've manipulated the Islamic message that we have.
Kila me gino wanyo kini kere kwena kila me wan chikere.
We should know
Wan yoro me.
that they could not have made this prediction
Kini pero me I ko gini kore gaisa ni.
in this time period
Kini kini me kare ni.
where the movement
Kame me word.
is in this period of uncertainty, of scattering, if we can say it that way.
Me word kare me ke to give me ke gino ko.
And I want to finish our presentation by making one point.
Sa me to tie ponye wani be ko gine share.
When we think about this concept of the last priest,
Kawa ne no wani tamu dia lamdo ga gikino.
the last priest
Lamdo ga giki.
being those people who came in at the end,
Mo be dia mo biru gini ya giki.
who need to be trained.
Me miro punki.
In the English, we use the phrase come up to par,
Lemon wano ko ni biru gino ko ho.
come up to equality,
Biru gini na kana jo ti ye.
come up to the same level.
Biru gini na lo me kila me jo ti kere.
All that is true,
Bonu shibera teni.
but there's a completely different story.
Ero di ko pora me pat.
It's not based upon when you join the movement,
Me ti chunki awene me do ni kere I wote.
it's based upon how much access you had,
Tia me lo ke gama duanga me yiro mu.
the quality of training that you received
Ko punya na ngwa me jo mi.
in this history.
Kini kile me kare no.
So there are people,
Ti jo.
we'll call them the last priests.
Moro gino lamdo ga giki.
These people
Joni.
are not trained
O punyu gi.
sufficiently.
Aber romo.
They're not sufficiently trained in this history, so they need to be trained here.
O punyu gi aber kini kile me kan yo punyi kan.
And that's a structural phenomena.
Mono beru kila me no line tell you to kere.
The structural phenomena is brought to view in these two passages here.
So kwana yo no mi wa me no.
But there's another
El ti me no ke me.
group of people that are not trained sufficiently.
Yo ke na me la po punyu gi aber.
And this is not about when you came in. This is the problem of this is the problem of gender. That in this history, the sisters of this movement were systematically undertrained. It was done proactively. It was done in some ways unconsciously. But it was done in a culture that was created and reinforced by Future for America. So Future for America have been instrumental in creating an environment in this history here, before harvest, that we have substantial portions of our movement, priests, not sufficiently trained. And this becomes a subject of Bible prophecy. So this movement, after its separation from Future for America, has to turn its attention and fix that problem. We have two problems to fix. One is that we need to recognize that as a movement, many of you are new. Whether you're a man or a woman. That is not the fault of Future for America. This is a structural phenomena. This time period is to train both those men and women. But there are another group of people, the sisters, those sisters who came into this history. Whenever you came in, they were not sufficiently trained either. And the reason for that lies at the doorstep of Future for America. And therefore, we must train and prepare these sisters to be ready to do the work for the Levites and the Nethinims. We need to correct the damage and the harm the Future for America have inflicted upon God's movement. This is the subject of Bible prophecy that's confronting this movement today. The work of preparation. I don't want to minimize this point. This point will get fixed. It is being fixed. If every single one of you watch the presentations, don't get distracted, understand what's happening, you'll be trained. What becomes the focus of our attention is this one. It's not just we believe in gender equality. What we need to recognize is whilst we are struggling with Future for America in this history, and we struggled with them in this history, part of that struggle that people have not understood is the reason we have this disparity was because of the theological and doctrinal positions that Future for America held to. And whilst we're trying to fix their mess that they created, if I can say it this way, whilst we're distracted fixing their mess, what are they doing? They're developing false messages, false doctrines The July 18 prediction
Maboni do para bo me do ambiro.
is one of their premier ones at the moment.
Bela cheli ya kile jama do ame kinte.
They're surreptitiously putting those into the mind of God's people,
Akara cha kuchungu no ke itama joba.
both priests
Ulamdo.
on their side and on our side,
Bol ki kunu ke me di bol wakane.
both Levites,
Dok na bol levi.
and now into the world they want to do this.
Na wi lo la me gini gini.
At the very time
Chawa me
that we
me wan
should be preparing,
yo bela moto yi here.
we're having to fix their mess.
Mami ko tik pe ha me gino kero.
So if you have any sympathy
Kai ti ke shona moro.
for the prediction,
Per pigesha gino.
before you start going into the details,
Me ko pe cha wo ni tu tere.
I want you to step back
Da mi ti ke nyik chen.
and see
Itenem.
what is happening in this history.
Mo amela ti me kiri me kare.
Why are we so fixated about the gender issue?
Pengo do tu lun ta ma tai ko kom wada me dia kina shock de mon.
We can have multiple layers of thought process of why that is.
Ora ke ta ma pol pengo ginu ti ki ton.
But the one I wanted to show you today
Ene me na mi don YouTube tin.
is Future for America.
Tieni future for America.
In this history, before the harvest, had developed two theologies.
Kini me kare on tu yo gen ta ma yo.
One of them
Chele ya kina gi.
was the false idea of time and geography.
Pero ko ba rashi ko ni arashi ko chawa kere kana morumu.
We'll call it the July 18 prediction.
Wa ko ni gesha me do para bor me do ma beiro.
And we need to fix that.
Wa mi ro yik man.
The second one they had,
Mari ame gin ti kere.
this false theology,
Bo punya me ti goba.
was the subjugation of women in our movement.
Pero di yu mono ko e wor wani ene.
And that we too need to fix,
Mono wana mi ro ye.
which is why we are so focused
Ena mi o mo tama lu tama te.
on the subject of equality.
Ko vi kombela na ni jo tia.
Not only is it a prophetic subject that we see in the world,
O bero ka dina no ano ne yu lobo.
we see it
Uneno ani.
as a response to the attack that Future for America has inflicted upon God's church.
Urone ne babelo do ko chien gina me video America ti kom wotu ban.
And whilst we're fixing their mess,
Kawan do ni ko pe hogi.
whilst we're saving
Kawan tu laro.
priests,
Lamdo.
whilst we're preparing the movement to do this great work,
Tawdo ye ko mu woti ne meti ngi ti ja di woki.
they continue
Gin mede gini kere.
to cause havoc
Metu tugu.
with their false ideas,
Kere pun kere tangi ame ti gobani.
whether it's false ideas of gender,
Kare ko bedi ni age arashi ko.
of time,
Shawa.
and geography.
Kere kana morumwa.
False ideas of the third woe.
Kira me gin ko gini kere arashi ko. Chana dota de kere.
Everything that they teach
Jamu du jame gin ponyo.
is all based on a false methodology
Gin ponyo gin ni be yo ti jame obero goba.
that looks so similar to the true
Melo nene te ha chal kere me na mo bera teni.
that if it were possible,
Ame kanu lare.
they would deceive even the very elect.
Rombo lo gina ha jo amo yero ko.
Let's pray.
Olegum.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness, your watch care. Please be with us as we begin this camp meeting. We ask, Lord, that whatever difficulties we might face, whatever problems might occur, that we would not let them overwhelm us to the degree that we would not hear your voice speaking to us. May each of us consecrate our hearts and our minds before you so that we might remember why we are here, to hear your voice speaking to us so that we might be prepared to do the work that you have given to us. We ask for a special blessing, special outpouring to be poured upon each of us, whether we're teachers, students, and particularly the organizers here at this camp. We know that Satan will be here trying to distract us through many means. Please help us not to fall prey to him. We pray in Jesus' name.